Hi, I'm excited to share that we have a new free bonus just for you.
We've started publishing our very own quarterly cyber risk management journal. It's loaded with over 30 pages of useful content taken directly from our podcast. Here's how we make each new edition.
So we start by transcribing the 4 or 5 episodes that we've published in the previous 3 months.
Next, we send our editor and designer the transcripts and our supporting materials for those episodes.
Then they revise all the text, they put clickable links in for all the resources, and they create the best look and feel for each episode.
And finally, we, Kip and I, make sure the finished PDF is ready for you.
So download the current edition now. All you have to do is go to b.link/CRMJ, that's the letter B, .link/CRMJ.
And if you like it, share it with your friends and encourage them to subscribe to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Now, on with the show.
Welcome to the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Our mission is to help you thrive as a cyber risk manager. On today's episode, your virtual Chief Information Security Officer is Kip Boyle, and your virtual Cybersecurity Counsel is Jake Bernstein. Visit them at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com.
Jake, hey, what are we going to talk about today?
Hey, Kip. Today, we're going to discuss one of my recent ransomware response cases and conduct kind of a post-mortem to see what we can learn in order to help our listeners prevent their own ransomware disasters.
Oh, this is going to be good. I think our audience is really going to appreciate this. If you are in the audience without having gone through a ransomware attack, this is going to be so helpful to you in terms of just preparing yourself, hopefully to avoid it, and certainly to prepare for one. So I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. And here's the thing that's, I think, one of my biggest takeaways that, and I'm already going off script here, is that there's no substitute for this type of experience. But here's the thing: you really don't want to be a victim. So the best way to avoid that, but still benefit from experience, is to listen to an episode like this, where we're going to put you in the shoes of the victim company. Who actually we will refer to interchangeably as the client, because they were my client, or the victim, no names, of course.
And, you know, I know from experience that a lot of people are not as interested in preventative activities. A lot of senior decision makers, right? I mean, because they could do prevention activities on a whole spectrum of risks, right? And so what I've noticed is they tend to just sort of assume that some things are going to happen, and if they do, well, we'll just clean them up. And that probably works for a lot of things. I think it's kind of just a truism, for entrepreneurs, right? Is that they can't fix everything, so they have to pick and choose, what they're going to fix or what they're going to prevent. And I would say that, of all the computer disasters that can befall you, this has got to be one of the worst. I mean, one of the ones you don't want to wait to fix until. Yeah,
and I think too that we'll talk about it, but it's also one of the ones that, in certain respects, is also the most preventable. And maybe I don't want to say preventable, because that is a little strong. But you can certainly prepare for ransomware in a way that you can't necessarily prepare for other types of computer-based attacks.
You can definitely reduce the risk.
You can. Okay, so here's a quick rundown to set the stage, and then Kip, you'll go ahead and kind of give the audience kind of our focus points, and we'll go through and discuss that. So
sounds good.
Here's the mini timeline. Late October, ransomware hit and encrypted all servers of the victim and completely shut them down. Within a few days, outside counsel, not me, had been retained, and an incident response company had been hired. Almost within a day of that, outside their primary counsel then called me in to assist. Now, here's an interesting thing. Within 2 or 3 days of hiring that incident response company, there were sufficient problems that the victim made the, in my opinion, drastic decision to hire a second incident response firm. And the client had the idea that both incident response firms would be working on the case, but that didn't last more than a few days. It was pretty clear, too many cooks in the kitchen. So once the second incident response firm was settled into place, a multi-week process of forensic investigation and recovery began. And all told, the victim was basically completely out of commission, out of business for at least 3 weeks, possibly 4, although they did start to get at least email and basic functions back. So that's the summary. Now, obviously, there's a whole lot of detail, and we will talk about it. But why don't we go ahead and kind of go through our list of what we wanted to focus on?
Yeah. Because even after you were just going through that very abbreviated timeline, I had to sit here with my hands, like I was sitting on my hands going, I want to ask about this. I want to ask about that. And if we did it that way, this episode would be very, very long. So rather than do that, what we're going to do is we've picked 5 things that we think are most relevant, and we're going to focus on those. So, all right. So the first thing that I think we ought to talk about that matters the most in terms of helping our audience prepare for this kind of an experience is the false start with the first incident response company, because that really strikes me as being like a major mistake, probably on par with the original mistake of somehow getting infected with ransomware. So tell us more about that.
Sure. So the false start was, fundamentally, the victim didn't have an incident response plan. And so right away, that's the big issue there. The time to, you can think of it this way. Incident response companies are like, they're like fire departments, except you have to pick your fire department, right? Because it's not as simple. It's not considered a service, at least not yet. I think we talked about that at one point.
Yeah.
But so, you really shouldn't go shopping on Google for an incident response company.
At the moment that you need them.
At the moment you need them, yeah. It would be like shopping for that fire department while the house is literally burning. Like, not good timing. And so that's the kind of basic, easy part is have an incident response plan and figure out who you're going to use ahead of time. Whether it's with outside counsel or not, but obviously,
or your insurance company, right? Because a lot of cyber insurance
yes.
policies is going to have this as an essential service built into the policy.
Yeah. Oh, spoiler alert here. The victim didn't have cyber insurance. Yeah.
Another massive misstep on their part. I feel bad for them. They probably didn't even realize.
Probably not. Yes. So now, but all of that being said, that's not why we had a false start with this company. I think, the issue really was performance. And obviously, I'm not going to name names here, but
everybody wishes you would, but I know why you won't.
I know, but I can't. But what I can do is point out the critical difference between the two IR companies, and that is what people have that I've recently learned is the difference between a tools-based approach and a skills-based approach to incident response. And this is, I think, really important. A tools-based approach requires, personnel who know how to operate a certain piece of software. That's the tool that I'm talking about, right? So usually it's something like a Carbon Black or a Microsoft ATP, which just stands for Advanced Threat Protection. But it's basically this whole EDR, new form of EDR, which I think stands for Endpoint Detection and Response software. That's the most common tool that I'm talking about here. But when an incident response company's primary strategy is to install an EDR software and let it do its thing, you're really missing out on a lot. And that is, it's a universal problem. Compare that with a skills-based approach where you have, frankly, trained hackers and anti-hackers or I should say counter hackers, kind of like sniper and counter sniper.
Yeah. Intelligence, counterintelligence.
Exactly. But you really, there's no substitute for just raw experience, and tools are great. Don't get me wrong. This was just to absolutely clarify, I'm not criticizing Carbon Black or Microsoft ATP. Heck, the both of those were used in this particular case. We ultimately used the Microsoft ATP software because it came with the company's Microsoft 365 subscription. But the software is not the problem. The software was great. It did its job. The problem is when you rely upon that and don't know how to do your own independent investigation. And the difference was stark. I saw the initial company, we had status calls, and more or less it was, we installed this piece of software. And we're letting it do its monitoring thing and trying to cleanse. And I don't think that's 100% fair. I think that this incident response company did a little bit more than that. But by comparison to the second one that ultimately was retained for the long haul, it was like night and day. The second company had experts who, had their own scripts and built their own scripts just for this client. They knew what they were doing. They knew how to look for things. It was a lot of work. Like, that's the thing that really struck me the most about both the forensic investigation and the recovery side is it is a lot of work. We're talking hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of man hours of time between digging through, log files, reconstructing complete network infrastructure, rebuilding virtual machines. It is a ton of effort and work. And so, one of the things that you want to think about is how big is my network? How many people do I think it's going to take? And then when you hire an incident response firm, one, ask about not just the forensic side, because that was another issue here, which I'll get to in a moment, but also the recovery side and how many bodies the incident response firm can throw at the problem.
Okay, so let's recap before we keep going. Let's recap. So
let me say one
Uh-huh.
last thing on this, because I do want to. It's important. Is that part of the problem with the first incident response company, and this wasn't really their fault, although it depends
it's ultimately on them.
It kind of was. I mean, they overpromised, but the problem. But I also think the client misunderstood. But the problem was is that the client thought they could hire one company to do the forensic investigation and the IT recovery. However, while the first IR firm, kind of said that it could handle both, what it really meant was we can do the forensic investigation, and we've got some contractors that we work with who can do the recovery. The problem is that during that time period, there were so many ransomware attacks, particularly on hospitals and elsewhere. This would have been in late 2020 for those listening in the future. And there was no one available. And so that became a major problem. So now we can go ahead, but I just want to point out that when you're interviewing incident response firms, ask about both forensics and recovery.
Okay. Wow. So in addition to all the other issues, there was just a flat out excessive market demand for the supply, right? Of people who could do that work. Is that what you were saying in this last point?
Correct.
One of the things you were saying? Okay. So that's really interesting, because I continue to say that the cybercrime wave that we're living through right now is wildly underreported in the news media. And so I'm on guard to find out, why is it underreported? But then also look for evidence that it really is substantial, that it is a substantial, a thing that's happening to us, despite the fact that it's not being reported very well, or completely. And that's just another example, right? Like, you wouldn't necessarily know, a senior cyber risk decision maker wouldn't know that there's a lack of vendors until they tried to go get one, right? They probably wouldn't know. I don't know.
There'd be no way to know.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
and honestly, the incident response firm itself didn't even know it was happening literally by the hour.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, so let's recap the first thing. So there was this false start with the first incident response company, and that was I think it's totally reasonable to say that that there were problems on both sides, right? The buyer not really understanding what they were trying to buy, the seller not really selling something that was going to to do the job, and then bringing in the second company. So you were talking about a tools based approach, and I don't know that I heard you say it. So I just want to be totally clear. You're saying that the first IR company was saying, "Hey, we're going to use a tools intensive approach to get you out of this ransomware."
Oh, they
situation.
didn't say that.
Oh.
Nobody says. I don't think anybody says that. I mean, that's a good point of clarification. I think when you're interviewing, you should ask about the training and the experience level of the actual responders, and try to discern, is this company selling me a tools-based approach or a skill-based approach? And you may not be able to get a straight answer, but I think it's worth. I mean, if you're the customer, it's definitely worth asking. And this is another reason, if you have the time, when you're doing an incident response plan, then it should be no problem to figure out, find a good company, ahead of time.
Right. Okay. And so I think that's one of the big takeaways, right? Is don't fumble around looking for an incident response and recovery firm when you need one, like in the moment. Have that sorted out in advance. And I really think the first, probably best option is just a really great cyber liability policy, because the insurance company will have already vetted all of this for you. They're only going to send people who are qualified. So that's what I think.
I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I would hope that's the case. I will say this: the incident response firm that was hired was a big name in some cases. And I mean, I think in the right circles, it's a big, well-respected name. The problem is that, again, and this is a broader cybersecurity problem, is that it's such a tempting market space that so many companies are trying to generate incident response capability, and there's not enough people with skills. So you kind of have to default to a tools-based approach. That's the broader issue. So I would just caution you even further.
So immaturity. I mean, so there's a lot of immaturity.
It is, and I think you definitely, the insurance company will help, but it's on you to find your preferred provider who is going to do the best job. If you're okay with a tools-based approach, then it doesn't matter as much, but that isn't necessarily the best possible incident response plan.
Okay. All right. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing that we want to point out from the timeline and from what you saw, and by the way, I didn't work on this case, right? So I learned about it after the fact, and I also learned about it through confidentiality filters too, right? Because I mean, I wasn't working on it; I had no right to know, least privilege and all that. But the second thing was the ease of infection, right? So, Jake, tell us how the ransomware got started.
So this is a really interesting and I think scary set of facts. Is we'll call the there was basically a laptop used by a typical, I think it was a mid-level manager, and it eventually, now obviously this is all stuff that we learned after the fact, hence why this is a postmortem. But the patient 0, which was this laptop, was infected at approximately 3:38 and 31 seconds on
approximately.
Approximately on a date in late September. And so what this means is that's when the malware was downloaded. Within 9 seconds, the malware had been executed on patient 0. Within 5 minutes, a second stage of payload, in this case, Cobalt Strike, was launched on patient 0. And then within 7 minutes more, the malware began initial network discovery. And then a few minutes after that, literally about 5. There was local escalation and credential dumping on patient 0. And then this took a bit longer. About 5 hours later, we were able to confirm escalation to a domain admin account. And then kind of over the next few days, there was additional discovery, RDPing to servers, installing and executing Cobalt Strike on servers. There was a bit of a lull of about 5 days where we believe that the bad guys were just distracted by something else, a different victim. And then there was about a 20-day span of internal data discovery activities, port scanning, web browsing, all that kind of good stuff. Uses of Mimikatz, which is a common tool to dump passwords from memory, and then at the end of that 20-day period, so this was late October. There was the key day was when they did a global webroot uninstallation. That's to clear the way. I think webroot is an AV software, and that cleared the way for the actual one. They deleted cloud resources, and it was a big one. So if you think you have the cloud, you may not. And then and only then did they do the ransomware encryption.
Okay.
So just to summarize, the entire process was less than a month, but the critical time period happened in minutes to a few hours.
Yeah. That's when the initial malware gained its foothold and was set itself up to be able to do all the other things it needed to do to prepare for the attack, to launch the attack.
And it's worth pointing out too that the way it started was that there was a the client had a customer whose website was compromised, and while the client was browsing its customer's website, it received the person received a pop-up message saying your Chrome browser is out of date and needs an update. And thinking, oh gosh, updating is important, so I'm going to do that. And it turns out, obviously, it was a fake download. It was a zip file with JavaScript inside, and that started the whole thing.
Okay, so so let's see. So the ease of infection. I mean, it really starts with this this person driving this laptop, who browses. I mean, this person's conducted in a legitimate business activity, trying to surf the website of their customer, and then they get this prompt and to do an update, and then they think, yeah, this that's good cyber hygiene, right? I should update my software. I should stay current, and then it just kind of rolls from there. And it sounds like it was essentially silent. Everything that happened in those first 20 days happened without notice by anybody. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And did you guys ever talk about like when it could have been noticed? Like, what were the missed opportunities to notice it? Did that ever come up?
It didn't really come up in the context of the incident response, primarily because it didn't really matter at that point. Definitely in terms of like what to do about it going forward, there was discussion on that. My impression is that the victim didn't have the cybersecurity capabilities that were even remotely necessary. So I think they had I don't really want to. I mean, there's not much to learn on this because they didn't have much to begin with.
Okay. All right. All right.
So
fair enough.
there would have been, had they been running an EDR piece of software, then they would have potentially been caught. So,
well, they had webroot.
They did have webroot. But what you'll hear about more and more is because of the way so much of these ransomware, and then, by the way, this was a sophisticated actor. Right. This was not malware as a service or ransomware as a service. This was we'll never know exactly who, but that it was a well-known and sophisticated group that is the likely cause of it.
So there was a crew, right? There was a crew of experienced operators making this happen. Okay. So, that really underscores a point that I try to make a lot, which is we're dealing with people here. It's easy to think, this is just a computer problem, or, this ransomware is causing all the trouble. But behind all of that are people, and they're just going to keep innovating and finding new ways to attack us and overcoming any obstacle in their path as they do what they do. And we certainly saw that here where you did. Okay. So we've got 5 major points. The first one was the false start with the IR company. The second one we just talked about, which was the ease of infection and the lack of detection. The third one, which I thought was fascinating, is the laundry network that was created for the recovery process. And I hadn't heard that term before. What's the laundry network, Jake?
So the laundry network, it's really just, I think other people might call it a quarantine network or something along those lines. But what it is it's a method to use when you're bringing servers back online. And this was largely because the backups had been deleted, the cloud had been deleted, and though I might as well just mention it now, the victim had tape backups, but they stopped updating them 2 years ago. So they didn't really have tape backups.
So it was so stale as to be unusable.
Exactly. Obviously, the takeaway there is you've got to follow the good old 3-2-1 rule with your backup strategy. And all that really means is 3 copies of all your data, one of which is production on 2 different media, and then 1 should be offline. And this is why you want a copy offline, because if something is online, it is inherently vulnerable to attack.
The first versions of ransomware didn't really do that, right? And so if you had a backup, it was relatively easy to dodge paying the ransom. But then the ransomware got really good at detecting and destroying backups that were online.
Yep. Well, I mean, someone wise wrote a book with the title "Fire Doesn't Innovate," and the corollary is that hackers do innovate all the time, constantly, nonstop, and ransomware is a good example of that. So
it's really forced us back into old things that we thought we'd never do again, like tapes.
Yeah. Well, but the thing about a tape, is that it's offline and you can't do anything to it once it's made. So it might be a pain, but man, is it effective as a backup strategy?
Well, yeah, but it is really a huge pain. I mean, I remember the days of tape, and we were all happy to leave tape behind us at one point, but we didn't realize we were walking into a trap. And so, welcome back, tape. Anyway.
Well, and we say tape, but it doesn't. I mean, there's different ways. You don't necessarily have to use old school tape. There's other ways that you could set it up. The bottom line is that one has to be offline. So,
but it's still a pain in the ass.
I know it is,
but you have to do it.
Which brings me back to the laundry network. The point of the laundry network is to be able to bring servers back online that have been cleaned. So not necessarily fully wiped, but cleaned using an EDR software of some kind. And then what you do is you and I say cleaned. I don't know the exact technical implementation going on here. My impression, though, my best understanding is that some of them were re-imaged. And so what you had to do was the laundry network was a very, very limited pipe out to the internet. Literally all it could do was access like Windows Update. And so what you would do is you would allow all of these machines to get updated. Part of the reason, by the way, for that was that when they weren't re-imaged, because I think the re-imaging was pretty, is considered pretty safe. Like if you re-image a machine, it's new, right? But for the ones that they couldn't do that on, one, they had to get access to the Windows Update and EDR service, because that's how those things work. And then you have to let them percolate or I suppose you could say launder and then dry, which just means give them time, because what you're doing is looking for attempted outbound communications to like the command and control server. So you do your best to clean it off, and then you let it sit and watch it. And you do that in the laundry network where you can't do any harm. And that's kind of the idea. And then once something has passed through the laundry network, which, it usually is a day or two, at minimum, then you go ahead and you can start to move it toward production. So that's what a laundry network is. And I'm making it, it's a lot of work. Like, it's a ton of work to set this all up technically. Conceptually, it's fairly simple, but it is not simple to execute. So it's, I think different companies will call it different things, but that's really what it is. It's
okay.
It's a methodology to clean servers.
And it's so concrete. Like, when you first mentioned the laundry network, I was like, I just had this image of industrial giant, washing machines that you would throw, like banquet linen into or something like that.
Right. I know. It's funny. And I think an interesting point here is this entire incident response was conducted remotely. That I didn't mention that at first, but I think it's worth pointing out. I mean, it's not, first of all, COVID definitely played a role in that. But it's also nice to know that it's possible. Now, that did cause some problems here and there. I mean, not having access to the network hard infrastructure can be challenging. Definitely caused some slowdowns, but it still worked. So,
yeah, and I don't think it betrays any confidences to say that the IR company was on a different continent than the victim.
They were.
I mean, just to say that, just so people understand that when you say like they didn't have physical access, I mean, like, they really didn't have physical access.
They really didn't have physical access. That is correct.
Yeah, so it's global, right? IR, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so that's the laundry network. That was the third thing. The fourth thing we've already kind of talked about, but is that their data backup strategy failed. And is there anything else to say about that?
No, I mean, it just didn't work. The ransomware found all the backups and killed them before it started the final encryption process.
I will add the idea that if you are going to make data backups, you do need to test them. You do need to test them to make sure that they work, because there's been lots of stories of people who made backups, but especially in tape land, and then found out when they tried to do a restoration that the tapes were either empty or formatted in such a way that didn't allow the data to be restored, or the data that was backed up wasn't quite right for whatever reason, and so data backups can fail, or they just aren't created correctly, and so you really do need to test them. Okay, and then the fifth thing is the role of the attorney. So listeners might be thinking, well, this is really interesting. So the attorney in the podcast is the one that participated in this, not Kip. And so why? So why, Jake?
Well, so a lot of reasons, really. To begin with, it's attorney-client privilege, as you know, as we've talked about. The lawyer needs to initiate contact and liaise with law enforcement, help with internal and external communication plans. A big part is to determine reporting obligations under local, state, federal, and international law. That is not as simple as it sounds. There's all kinds of pieces of analysis that goes into that question. I think a really interesting piece is to help the client navigate cryptocurrency and the risk of sanctions over or under the OFAC list. So that came up in this case where, and one of the things that you wanted to talk about was payment. And the victim, early on, the victim was kind of assuming that it had to pay. And so the question was, how do you pay? And that's when we ran straight into the brick wall of the the October 1st, 2020 OFAC or Department of Treasury memo about the OFAC list, and which just means there's basically you can be sanctioned for paying ransoms to any person or organization listed on the OFAC list, which is kind of in some ways adding insult to injury. Like, you're already hurting, and now the government's saying, oh, by the way, we don't really want you to pay the ransom and get your stuff back, assuming that it worked. And the way around it is to work with law enforcement. It's not a hard and fast rule, and I think that's a major component of kind of counseling with the lawyer. And then insurance coverage issues broadly, and analyzing third-party liability. That's a big part as well. What can go wrong? What if your infection leads to another infection, et cetera, et cetera?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay, so there's a lot there, and I wanted to clarify a couple of things. OFAC is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. That's what that little OFAC acronym means, and it is part of the Department of Treasury. And I would recommend that if you haven't seen that memo that came out, you should go grab it and study it. And the practicality of it is, here's the U.S. government trying to sanction other countries for doing things that the U.S. doesn't want them to do. So, for example, North Korea, right? Just to make a big example here, they are pursuing nuclear weapons, and they've been sanctioned quite a bit, and so but they still want to pursue this. So they're looking for hard currency. Well, guess what? This is how they do it. This is one of the groups out there that is trying to raise hard currency. And so I don't think it's a surprise that the group that is monitoring economic sanctions, would be interested in this, since it's become such a revenue stream for these sanctioned countries. And then the other thing I want to point out is, we did an episode of this podcast a while back. It dropped on November 24th, when we talked about that there were new rules for attorney-client privilege over data breach reports. We were looking at the Capital One case at that time. So did you have to factor any of those new rules into the ACP that you were helping to provide in this case?
We did. And I mean, yes and no. That definitely informed our entire approach. In a bizarre twist, because the company didn't have an incident response plan and didn't have an IR company on any kind of contract, the exact facts of the Capital One case were impossible to happen. But otherwise, yes. I mean, it informed a great deal of how we operated.
That's great. And you were successful in establishing ACP, as far as you know?
As best as anyone could, yes.
Yeah, in uncertain times and uncertain situations. So yeah, so anybody who didn't listen to our episode from November 24th, new rules for attorney-client privilege over data breach reports, go check that out. And so those are the 5 top things that we wanted to really, bring out from Jake's experience on this ransomware case. Any final thoughts, Jake?
I really just get a backup strategy in place. That's so critical.
Yes, a data backup strategy, and have that IR plan. Test it. It's really not that tough, but it's one of these important but not urgent things, and so it can really you can really have a hard time getting it onto the calendar of your senior decision makers. I face this all the time, so I totally understand that it can be difficult, but but we're here to tell you that it's totally worth it. So
it is,
please do that. All right. Well, that wraps up this episode of the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Today, we discussed a modern ransomware experience that Jake went through, and we shared with you some really important post-mortem lessons to be learned. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on the Cyber Risk Management Podcast. Remember that cyber risk management is a team sport, so include your senior decision makers, legal department, HR, and IT for full effectiveness. So, if you want to manage cyber as the dynamic business risk it has become, we can help. Find out more by visiting us at cyberriskopportunities.com and focallaw.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.